So we can go.
All right. Good morning, Doug. Today we're going to talk about continuity of government based and really in the context of this book that we just finished reading called Raven Rock. It was very interesting. What were some of the big takeaways you have from this book? Things that stood out to you?
Well, here's the book. And I first discovered it because I read a pretty glowing review in, I think it was the New York Review of Books. And basically what this book is about is it talks about the US government's plans to maintain itself after a nuclear war. And people would figure, well, of course, we need a government and the government has to survive the nuclear war. And this book is interesting because it traces the, from when the possibility of a nuclear war first became apparent. At first we had a civil defense program where, how are we going to get 200 million people in underground bunkers and survive as the upper world is a radioactive apocalyptic holocaust, and how it's evolved from there with all the stupidities and immense wastes of money that the government has. But this book is very interesting in that it probes, not from any particular point of view. I mean, I don't really know much about the author, but I think he sees it as being really, really kind of stupid and not going anywhere because he's pointing out that none of this shit can work, but it's immensely expensive, and it's just about the top levels of government, and not even their families, and the bickering about, well, can my family go underground? It's just all crazy what they're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, in reading this book, it became clear how the possibility of a deep state could actually emerge. Essentially, in trying to create how the government can survive long enough to, to basically push the button and make sure that all of our nukes are deployed, and to destroy our enemy or whatever. In the effort to make sure that someone was around to do that, they built this whole sort of shadow process.
Yeah, and there is a discussion in the book about, let's suppose that the Soviets or the Ruskies or whoever launches a very successful strike on the US, and the US is just a smoking ruin. But the various parts of the Trident, the bombers, the siloed missiles, and the submarines, they still survive. Now the question comes up, what's the point of destroying the enemy since we're destroyed? Obviously, mutual assured destruction has failed. Okay, so, well, they pulled one over on us. So should we destroy them too? I mean, this is actually a good question.
Right. And one of the things in that, eventually after, so this was all originally set up under Ike, and then it goes through basically each administration, since then, all the way really up till, the Obama administration. And it's interesting to see the way that most of these administrations all handled it exactly the same way as the one before. They just kind of doubled and tripled down on each other, including I thought was really interesting with Jimmy Carter, who is thought of as this like peacenik sort of president, but he actually took the commander-in-chief role incredibly seriously and like really, got into the war gaming and all of that. And it's very interesting. But at the end of the day, I think that there's at some point going from administration to administration that one realized like this is just total insanity. Like, we're all like, who would even want to live? Who would even want to be around after the world is destroyed by by us and the Soviets?
Yes, it's like any government program, unless you actually put a bullet through its head. I mean, unless you pull it out by the roots, that's not good enough. Any government program, you can't pull it out by the roots. You've got to put a pound of Agent Orange on the place where it came from to make extra sure that nothing survives. So these underground bunkers that the government has been building and various other things to ensure continuity of government, which is something very different from the continuity of existence of the United States, the geographical area. I mean, they're two different things. 'Cause I've been saying for years, people have a very unfortunate tendency to conflate the government with the country. And not only are they not the same thing, they're actually antithetical things. Anyway, so it goes into the construction of bunkers to preserve bunkers under the White House. And, I think he got a lot of really fantastic information in this book. I don't know where or how he got it all. He did immense research. And obviously, everything he came up with was declassified, because if it was still classified, I mean, he'd be in a black site or be sued or something like that. I don't know. But do you remember a short reference where there's supposed to be now a substantial bunker under the U.S. with under the White House with tunnels and things like this going down many stories? I
Yep.
mean, there was a brief reference to that. Maybe you couldn't get all the data. Did you recall that?
Yeah, I do. I don't remember how large it was, but yeah, it seems like there's a significant underground complex below DC that kind of connects different parts of DC together and actually allows for, essentially exiting kind of the more congested parts of DC so that people could get out of the area if they needed to quickly underground. But yeah, they have these tunnels. They have these bunkers really everywhere. And I mean, Raven Rock itself, which is what the book is named after, is that in Pennsylvania, was it?
Yeah, it's close to Gettysburg, close to the Maryland line. I've never been there, but I kind of know the area a little bit.
Yeah. And so they go through
So that's the biggest one. And what was the last thing that they said? That, this book was, I think it went to press in like 2018 or something like that. And he said the last figures that the government had released on it were 850,000 square feet. It's like an underground city. I mean, that's how many square feet are in an acre? 44,000, I believe. So if it's 850,000, that's like 20 acres. But these things grow like topsy. And another interesting thing is these things used to be super double secret, where nobody could say anything. Even the locals didn't know what was going on. And it was, because they didn't want to attract the attention of the Soviets as a nuclear target, because this is where all the high government officials were going to go. And God forbid a nuclear bomb went off anywhere near them. So, but in recent years, these things have become unimportant, or word has leaked out and they figure there's no longer any point to trying to keep it secret. I don't know. Becomes a little bit unclear there how secret these things are, because a lot of what they talk about in the book is how you evacuate high government officials necessary to the continuity of government from Washington, D.C., which should be a smoking ruin, of course, to these various places where they can rebuild. Raven Rock is the big one, and the other one is Mount Weather, which is just outside Berryville, Virginia, a little town, which I know very well. I lived there actually for some years, and everybody knew about Mount Weather back then when it was being built.
Well, they have several others that they talk about. They talk about Greenbrier, which is it's a hotel resort, which I've been to, which was like where Congress was supposed to reconvene essentially in an emergency. And then of course they had the one that they didn't keep secret was NORAD, Cheyenne Mountain here in Colorado. That was actually, they opened with kind of public fanfare and, made a big deal out of it. But yeah, it was all very, very secret. And I mean, there could be obviously, one of the things that struck me about this book, well, there are two things. Number one was just how much energy and capital had been devoted to these efforts over the years. And even the formation of FEMA, which I think of as, like with the force that kind of brought in supplies after Katrina. I just always thought of them as like for disasters. It turns out that they were actually, that a huge part of this continuity of government stuff fell under their umbrella. And it's something like 2/3 of their budget was kind of a black site stuff or a black budget stuff. I mean, where it wasn't in the eye of the public, and, there was no sort of justifications they had to make for how things were spent. And I had no idea that that's what FEMA was really about, that that's what most of their budget was devoted toward.
Most of what I've heard about FEMA, I mean, the only direct or actually indirect encounter I've had with FEMA was after Katrina. I took a tour of the devastated areas of New Orleans that were under floodwater. And I remember there was one clutch of about a dozen guys standing around with their FEMA jackets, blue with yellow letters, FEMA on the back. They were just standing around talking or supervising some guy digging a ditch. I mean, it seemed like absolutely pointless. Anyway, I always thought of FEMA as being a joke. And the other thing I've heard about with FEMA is, of course, they're responsible for these famous FEMA camps. I don't know how many there are or supposed to be, or indeed whether they exist or not, and why are they there, or anything. I mean, have you discovered anything anecdotally about these things?
I haven't. There's been I've read about them or heard about these things, but that's one area that in this book the guy didn't really cover. I was hoping, I think you were too, that he would get into that. Maybe that part is still classified. Maybe that part is still secret, and so he couldn't reveal it. But I have to use a George W. Bush reference here and say that I'm sure that those FEMA guys down there were doing a heck of a job.
A heck of a job, right? Well, Trump would have said the same thing. Fantastic job, a spectacular job, right?
But remember what George W. Bush said, you're doing a heck of a job, Brownie, the guy who was in charge of FEMA at the time.
Yeah.
So,
I know. But are there these FEMA camps? It was Jesse Ventura, I think, when he was governor of Minnesota, was it?
Yep.
That, or before that, he tried to investigate the existence of these camps, and even he couldn't, with his connections, get any answers about what are they there for? What do they do? Anything.
Yeah.
But there's all these things, and the other thing, it was actually very strange. As we were talking about, talking about this book yesterday, what happens, but some Looney Tunes ex-subscriber of mine who got a hold of my email sent me an email on underground government facilities, underground military facilities. And of course, this was really crazy stuff. There used to be, I don't know if you ever heard of this guy. This was a couple of decades ago. A guy named, I have the wonderful name of Peter Beater, Dr. Peter Beater. Did you ever hear about him?
Oh, I never did.
Okay, so there's a whole group of people that apparently believe in reptilians and aliens having underground bases in the Arctic and all kinds of really crazy stuff. So this woman sent me something where, it says, and there are thousands of these underground bunkers in the US, and one of them goes down 800 miles under the surface of the earth. Obviously, anybody that's writing this now is doing very heavy drugs to even put something like that on paper as being possible. But I got that yesterday when we were talking about it, which makes me wonder, whether this isn't all a
simulation.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe the reptilian people are right. But then there was another deep underground bunker, I forget where, called Mount Pony, where the Federal Reserve, its facilities started out small. And then, like all these things, they grow and grow to hundreds of thousands of square feet underground, massive facilities with bunks and many months of food. And and lakes of water, which are reservoirs, which are constructed and so forth. So the Federal Reserve has one. And then it didn't mention this that I saw, but having lived in Washington for years, I heard about the IRS's survival facility, which is in Martinsburg, West Virginia, where they have massive computer capacity along with survival capacity, because God forbid the tax revenues don't come in after a global thermonuclear war.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
It's
how
it's
many
still,
other agencies have outfitted themselves? And one of the fun parts of this book was these high government officials, there's room for X number of people should the flag go up. Okay, that's fine. But what about my family? I mean, what happens to them? And then, of course, there's a discussion about, well, hey, if my family doesn't get to go, maybe I'm not going to go. I don't want to leave my family out there. What kind of a human being am I? I don't know. Probably agents, but but these questions are addressed, and they're interesting.
yeah, I think one of the I was going to say the second thing that really stood out to me with this in reading this book that really shocked me was, the fact that these continuity of government policies essentially, assume that there's martial law everywhere, and the entire constitutional framework doesn't matter anymore. And and there's one quote I had from one of the COG officials said, "National emergencies, I imagine we would do whatever needed to be done." So this continuity of government official says, "We are not evil men, and no one likes to violate constitutionally guaranteed civil liberties at any time. But if you can save an additional 100,000 lives, some rules might bend under wartime or emergency conditions." So that it seemed one, and one of the things that struck out to me on the same lines was that apparently during they talk about during the Kennedy administration and ongoing administrations as well, but the attorney general has in a basically a continuity of government briefcase that's with him at all times, a list of undesirables that should be rounded up as soon as basically someone pulls the ripcord and says, okay, let's go continuity of government operations. And it's just frightening that you could imagine that they have these lists available, that they're just, when they're worried, they basically round everyone up.
Yeah. First thing is continuity of government, which has very little to do with the continuity of civilization or the country itself. Reading this book and the conversations which are quoted between government officials and so forth, a lot of it reminded me of that wonderful movie, what was Der Untergang in German. It was called Downfall, where Hitler's in the bunker and Hitler still thinks he's moving around these divisions on the surface, but it doesn't exist. It's just a fantasy. The only thing that exists is the bunker at that point. That's exactly what these people remind me of. So, but they're still expanding these facilities, I guess. And of course, this is a perfect example of how the government and the military inevitably fight the last war. Nuclear missiles are old technology. Nuclear bombs are old technology. The next war is going to be a computer war where none of their communications work, and a biological war that, whether COVID has something to do with that or not, I don't know.
Time will tell.
But none of this stuff will be of any use whatsoever if it's a computer war and biological war. And I think it'll be both.
Well, and even in some of the training exercise they did and the dry runs and the false alarms that they had, it didn't work then either, even assuming the old stuff. So, one of the things they go through what happened on 9/11, and they talk about exactly where everyone was at the time, and, with Cheney in the bunker, and, and Bush was, doing some story time with kids, and then was off in the Air Force One. And his communications, apparently, the president's communications in Air Force One did not work. Like, he could not talk to for long periods of time different people, and specifically because Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense, wouldn't go to his COG bunker or whatever and stayed at the Pentagon. They talked about his frustration that they can't even talk to these key members of the government, in that time where no one knows what's going on. And this other thing is that they didn't know what was, according to this book, they didn't know what was going on at 9/11. Like, they didn't know, they thought more planes were coming in to attack things. It seemed that, like, they were clueless, despite, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars that have been devoted toward these efforts and the upgraded communication systems over that time. That didn't work. They couldn't even talk.
It was a giant Chinese fire drill, to use the rather, I guess, politically incorrect saying. Uh, it was like trying to get the Department of Motor Vehicles organized. I mean, or the post office. None of it worked. It was just all chaos. So all you had was this infrastructure and these hundreds of billions of dollars invested in computers, but nobody knew who was in charge here, or if the president was in charge, or this guy's in charge. You can't find the president, so who's number two? It's chaos, and that's just a test or something that's trivial, not the real thing. So the problem is, there was, early in the book, it mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it was very, very hard for Kennedy to communicate with Khrushchev, where they actually had to use commercial, like Western Union, had to send a courier by to the Russians to pick stuff up. I mean, this is, it's like out of Dr. Strangelove, which for my money is still one of the 10 best pictures ever made. It's just hilarious, and it's so accurate in so many ways.
Yeah, and I think that despite their efforts to constantly upgrade communications, they spent huge amount. Like, almost every administration realized that something wouldn't be good enough, or that the process wouldn't work right, so they spent more time upgrading it. And one of the most where they spent, it seems like, they were really obsessive about, was who would be in charge and how everyone would know that that person was in charge. And they have this, everyone's probably heard of this idea of the designated survivor. That's one of the ideas that came out of this continuity of government planning. But there's a whole series of this, of individuals, essentially, in a complicated procedure for identifying them. They all have these authentication pieces that with them at all times. And, so they put enormous amounts of energy into that, but all of that is outside of the constitutional purview. I mean, that's one of the things that really stands out about this. This is like this. It just shows that the Constitution is not, I mean, you talk about it being a dead letter all the time, but you can see in practice here that it has no impact on exactly how people are going to handle things in a crisis, and how they're going to use the military, and how they're going to use force, and how they're going to sacrifice all individual liberties at the drop of a hat, honestly, if something comes to it.
That's right. The little people actually don't count. And talking about IDs to just determine who's in charge here. In one version of Dr. Strangelove, and unfortunately there are a couple of versions floating around of it with scenes cut out, but the unexplicated version, there's one where President Doppelganger, played by Peter Sellers, is going to the bunker, and the guard won't let him in because he doesn't have his little badge. And he says, "I'm the president, don't you know that?" He says, "Yes, I know that, sir, but you don't have your badge." It's all just Kafkaesque. It's also crazy.
Yeah.
But what's going to be done with these many, many millions of square feet of government facilities buried under mountains to survive 100 years from now, maybe 50 years from now? These things are going to be basically ruins, sealed in back of their 3-foot thick steel doors.
Yep.
And I mean, this can be wonderful for archaeologists, perhaps from another planet, to discover sometime in the future.
Yeah, I
What
wonder.
were these idiots thinking?
Yeah, exactly. They'll wonder what crazy religion or God were they worshiping that they would go through and, sacrifice all their time and treasure to digging these holes in the ground. You know what I mean? They won't
They're
make it.
the only things that are going to survive are geological processes, even because they're put in generally geologically stable areas, so that these bunkers, continuation of government bunkers, are really going to turn out to be the pyramids of our day and age, I think.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I think that's true. So one of the, when they wrapped this book up, I think one of the way he left it very open ended, and I would really encourage anybody who really wants to understand this, this sort of shadow government, how it really does exist. And actually, let me say one thing about that. One of the things about it is that most of the Congress people, even the ones who are supposed to be saved if continuity of government operations are enacted, don't know anything about it. And you see that them running into it all the time. So so in that respect, it certainly is a shadow government. If the people who are supposed to be saved by it, even, and who are supposed to sort of plan, where the legislative process, where money is spent and all of that, if even they don't know about, the facility is supposed to go to or whatever else, then you can be sure that there's, the institutions, these shadow institutions that support it are, shadowy. I mean, they really are. So I think that I found very interesting. I also found the kind of consistent incompetence by these guys very interesting. And actually, and we backtrack. The Cuban Missile Crisis is known as the time we came closest to nuclear war, but uh, there's this. I think it was in 1980 under the Carter administration when they had like a computer bug from a $46 part
Oh, yes.
that was essentially reporting nuclear missile launches against the U.S. that were doubling like every number of minutes. So it went from 2 to 4, ultimately at 2,200. Missiles in the air. They thought, on the way to the U.S. was basically what it was by the time I think President Carter found out about it. And then almost like the next second, it said it went to zero. It said there was none. But it's just the craziness of the complicated technology and all this stuff makes it so likely to fail. It's shocking. And how close we came to total ruin of a $46 part is pretty insane.
I'm just surprised that we haven't had an accidental nuclear war up until now. I mean, it's really just been good luck, quite frankly.
I think so too. So what was it? What would you take? What was the big takeaway?
What,
So what are the big takeaways from this book, Doug?
well, what's the big takeaway from this book? One thing that did impress me about the book is this thing is so crammed full of facts and data and all kinds of things. It's really quite an accomplishment on the part of this chap Graf. Um, but what's the takeaway from it? It's that relying on the government, and he points out, yeah, the guy that wrote this,
Go ahead, Doug.
Graf, is by no means a libertarian. He's not an anti-state guy. He seems like a reasonable guy who's looking at it and says, you've got the government is basically a bunch of robotic cubicle dwellers on the one hand and power mad maniacs guiding them. So it's a depressing book because to me it leaves as many. Okay. I mean, this book is just jam-packed with data and history and answers on all kinds of things to do with government bunkers and continuity of government and all kinds of things like that, the nuclear missile program. But to me, it brings up more questions in the end than we even have answers, because there's obviously a lot of stuff that he was not able to dig up because obviously, most of this stuff is still classified. And the stuff he does bring up makes me think this is really very scary. What we're dealing with here are megalomaniacal maniacs on top, and they're just basically shifting around a bunch of robotic type cubicle dwellers on the bottom. So, and they have control of thousands of nuclear devices, not to mention the Russians, and not to mention the Chinese and the Brits and the French, who are undoubtedly in exactly the same position. So anyway,
Well, the other,
book worth reading.
yeah, I definitely think so. And one of the things that stood out to me, just kind of wrapping it up here, is that, if you have, he talks about what happened with Katrina and, the use of FEMA and the military in that situation. And he talks about the fact that if you had any doubt what, the state would do in what it deemed a very serious crisis, if you study what happened in Katrina, you can see it. And that is that the martial law was declared, the military was deployed, US soldiers went, house to house and disarmed people. So, and that was a small localized disaster, but, they certainly felt comfortable sort of exercising those authorities and depriving people of their civil liberties and all that along the way, in that limited disaster. So you just can imagine what happens when there's a real crisis where they really feel worried what's happening.
Yeah, all I can be sure of is that something wicked this way comes.
That's a great way to finish it. All right. Thank you, Doug. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.